Good evening, everyone, and welcome once again to the NAC at Home Fashion at Home series. Fashion at Home is our program, but the NAC at Home fashion programs. And I jumped ahead of myself, the title of which tonight is Fashion at Home, with a very good friend of mine and a new friend of the club's, Annette Becker, who is the curator and fashion historian at the University of North Texas in the Texas Fashion Collection. And I know all of you here are fashionistas. I know you know many things about fashion, but did you know Denton, Texas has one of the largest fashion collections in the United States and the largest in Texas with over 25,000 pieces? And we are fortunate enough to have the curator of that collection to explain her new exhibit to us. Once again, Fashion at Home. And before I turn it over to her, of course, I have to say that we are sponsored by the National Arts Club, a 501c3 not-for-profit in New York City, and as part of our mission to stimulate, foster, and promote the arts among the American people, the Fashion Committee reaches out to any number of curators, archivists, collectors, fashion designers to really bring their perspective to fashion. And we are especially happy to have young and up-and-coming curators, such as Annette, who have a really unique new vision and a new perspective on fashion that takes into account changing times and the intersection between society and fashion. And she'll tell you more about her particular point of view as we go through this. But it is the first of our series of our young curators as well. And we're very excited, Annette, to have you. So away you go.
I'm so pleased to be here with you all this evening as part of the National Arts Club programming, especially since it looks like we have people joining from all over the country, maybe all over the world even. As I think I saw in the chat, someone mentioned they're coming from Toronto. We have someone from Wisconsin with us this evening. So I want to thank you all for taking the time to be with me this evening. So as you all have probably heard a few too many times in this time of Zoom, I'm now going to share my screen to present to you some research that I've conducted sort of under the title this evening of Fashion at Home, especially since this is still a virtual program that we're doing through the National Arts Club. I think it seems particularly appropriate to talk about at-home clothing as we're all at home enjoying this program. So this evening, the plan is that I'll introduce the Texas Fashion Collection to you all just briefly, especially since I know not all of you live in Denton, Texas, or maybe haven't even heard of us before. After that, I'll be sharing a little bit about the history of fashion that has led up to some of our pandemic era choices that we've made about how we clothe ourselves, especially since pandemic era clothing feels very new and fresh and different to us. I think it's exciting to sort of put our current fashion decisions into a longer historical context. And then towards the end of the program, I'll be switching from my laptop to my cell phone so that we can go sort of live into part of our collection to look at a few artifacts up close and personal. So just so you all kind of have a lay of the land for the next hour or so. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to my very favorite thing in the entire world, which is the Texas Fashion Collection. We're housed at the University of North Texas's College of Visual Arts and Design. And as Gordon mentioned, our collection has about 20,000 historic and designer garments and accessories, primarily spanning about 250 years of fashion history. You can see in this photograph that our collection storage area is large and packed almost literally from floor to ceiling with garments. As you can see in this photograph, we have 2 stories of clothing that we have to use a big industrial ladder to get up to the very tip top to reach some of the pieces. You can see in the top left-hand corner of the photo an array of brilliant pucci prints. So if we want to get those, we have to get up on our ladder, just to give you an idea of the breadth of our collection. So as we share a few pieces later in the presentation, you know that they're just some of many that the TFC includes. If you're interested in exploring our collection further after this presentation, I'd encourage you to go to our website. We have a partnership with the libraries on UNT's campus to digitize our collection. So we've made it to 6,551 of our artifacts that you can access on there, with between 2 and 20 photographs of each piece and descriptions of all of those. So even though this program is an hour, I hope you are inspired by fashion history and get to spend some time looking through our digital resources there. And so you know a little bit about how we deploy our collection. We often host research appointments with people from a lot of different backgrounds in our space. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see a photograph of 3 textile designers who came to our collection to research textiles that we don't often see in current textile and fashion contexts right now. So this is a 19th century example of an ikat, which is a really complicated way of dyeing threads before weaving fabric. And you can tell that these 3 UNT alums who are working in the fibers world were really inspired by this textile and then went on to make new textile designs based on this historic piece. You can also see on the right-hand side of the screen an example of an 18th century embroidered suit that some of our lifelong learning students in the North Texas area came to research. So here we have a research assistant pointing out some of the floral embroidery along the center front opening of one of those coats. And then for people who might live in the Texas area, I'd encourage you to keep an eye out for some of the exhibitions that we mount. The Texas Fashion Collection includes about 20,000 garments, but for better or worse, we don't have our own exhibition space. So we often partner with area cultural institutions to share the artifacts that we have. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see a photograph from the exhibition Reimagining the Kimono, which was mounted at North Park Center in Dallas, which is a high-end shopping center meets fine art collection, a really important cultural space for our region that sees about 29 million visitors a year. It's a really important space for us because there are a lot of fashion consumers actively making decisions about what they purchase and wear in this high-end shopping center. So a really great unconventional way to share fashion history with an audience. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a photograph from an exhibition that we mounted at the Bullock Texas State History Museum in Austin. Specifically exploring the history of Neiman Marcus, the Dallas-based department store, who also started the Texas Fashion Collection in 1938. And that exhibition focused on what was called the Oscars of Fashion, a fashion award that was given to people like Christian Dior, Coco Chanel, and then a large smattering of international and American designers. It was exciting to be able to share fashion in a history museum context, and a point of pride that it was their very first fashion exhibition. So with that, we can kind of dig into a little bit more of the meat of this presentation. The reason I really wanted to share some of this research with you really stemmed from an opportunity to mount an exhibition in North Park Center, the cultural space that I mentioned previously. So North Park Center is a space, again, that sees about 29 million people a year, that has both middle tier and high end like fashion retail spaces. And is really a site that people from all over the world, but especially in North Texas, come to engage in shopping. It's really important to me to make the collection accessible and think about ways that we might do public outreach and make our collection really relevant to people. We have an ongoing partnership with North Park Center, and I thought in them offering us their space to us in early 2021, that there could be few things more on people's minds than the pandemic and the way that the pandemic has really shaped our wardrobes. So as we go through this presentation this evening, I hope you'll think about ways that your wardrobe has changed over the past 18 months. Maybe some garments that you've worn more regularly than you have anticipated, maybe than you have in the past, types of clothing that maybe you've added to your wardrobe. You might even think about how you're dressed this evening and how that might compare to if we were all in person engaging in this program in a shared space. I think it's really important that as we're sort of processing what the pandemic has meant for us individually, we also think about what that means for our designed lives, the designed world around us, and how that relates to us as a culture, but then also us individually. One of the places that really hit me first was that I was wearing a lot of comfortable clothing at home, and started thinking about the way certain styles of clothing sort of came forward in my wardrobe. One of the styles that I think has really impacted a lot of people's wardrobes, especially through fashion press and coverage, has been things like the nap dress. So in this slide, you can see a photograph on the right, which is of the Ellie nap dress, which was designed by Nell Diamond for Hill House. This is a design that Nell Diamond started creating in 2019, so pre-pandemic. And I think she trademarked the name nap dress, which is a pretty new form of clothing in some ways. Trademarked that in January of 2020. So again, pre-pandemic, she was not creating these to kind of exploit the situation that we've all found ourselves in. But needless to say, these nap dresses definitely resonated with a lot of people. As you can see from the sort of fashion blog coverage, this was just one of many articles that reported that in late October, I think it was, of last year, so just about a year ago, that these fairly inexpensive cotton dresses sold more than $1 million worth of product in 30 minutes of these designs being launched on Hill House's website. This is an example that we purchased for our collection because we're trying to be kind of responsive in what we include in our fashion archive. This example retailed for $125. So you can imagine how many $125 dresses it took to add up to $1 million worth of sales. Definitely this nap dress as a new form of clothing resonated with COVID era audiences. But I have to admit, as a fashion historian, even though this is a new form of clothing, it did not feel so new to me. So I, in this slide, share a few examples of pieces in our collection that through the materials and design, I think really resonate with this nap dress created by Nell Diamond. So in the three photographs to the left and towards the center, you can see a white cotton children's dress from around 1900. You can see a dinner gown from 1930 next to that, and then a pictorial paper pattern from around 1907. Showing a nightgown. So as we look at this nap dress, we can see that it's made out of really simple cotton poplin fabric. It's not sheer. It's opaque enough that this could be worn outside and in public, but is a really lightweight fabric that's really comfortable. It's a type of fabric that we often see in children's clothing and in nightgowns because it's so breathable. We can also see a smocked bodice, which is something that we often see in children's clothing as a way to manipulate fabric so that it has some stretch and also can create a tighter bodice with more fullness and a skirt to facilitate easier movement. So from a design perspective, this nap dress, has a lot of precedence before it, but especially in this new cultural context, I think this nap dress means something slightly different. So really, this nap dress was sort of the jumping off point for an exhibition that I feel very lucky to have been able to mount. So in researching for this exhibition, there were kind of two themes that came forward and thinking about what at-home clothing has meant for people over the past 100 years or so. The two main themes that I hope that we can think about together for the next 45 minutes or so are ways that at-home clothing first challenges fashion rules, especially since these clothes are not completely private because they are being seen by other people sometimes, especially today through Zoom cameras, but also historically sometimes through small social gatherings, especially informal ones. But then these clothes aren't also quite public because these aren't being worn to things like restaurants or to public events, occasions, something that has a fancier, more formal sort of like dress code with it. And I think in that flexibility and being in sort of a liminal space between public and private, that has especially given women a space to sort of experiment with some of the rules of dress and often have more bodily freedom with their clothing and even cultural freedom. So that's a sort of thread that we can track through the rest of the presentation. And then one other thought that I think would be important for us to consider this evening, and then even beyond as we think about our own wardrobes, are thinking about ways that fashion designers often look to non-Euro-American cultures for inspiration. I'm sure most of us have heard of the phrase cultural appropriation, and some of us, get on our soapboxes with that, and some of us shy away and don't want to get in arguments about it. But I think, especially in thinking through at-home clothing and its history, it's really important to consider the ways that fashion designers, especially American fashion designers, looked to these cultures that they didn't understand completely, but had a humanistic interest in, how that sort of gave way to new forms for better and for worse in some of our at-home clothing. So I hope you'll keep these 2 points kind of tucked away in the back of your head as we go through some examples from the Texas Fashion Collection's holdings and that were shared at the North Park exhibition. So we'll begin, since I promised 100 years of fashion history, we'll begin in the 1920s. I wanted to share with you the oldest piece that was in this exhibition, which is also one of the oldest sets of pants designed for women that are in part of the TFC's holdings. So if you look at the photograph on the right, this is an installation shot of the exhibition. And at the very forefront, you can see a black velvet ensemble from the 1920s. This was framed to us when it was donated as a hostess ensemble. And I think it's exciting to think about what it meant for a hostess ensemble to exist in the 1920s. If we think back to some of our history classes, I think one of the defining things in American culture about the 20s was prohibition. So a lot of entertaining that had previously happened in bars and restaurants, kind of out in very public spaces that were associated with alcohol consumption. Some of those things still continued, especially if we have some New Yorkers who are thinking about New York history with prohibition. But in a lot of other parts of the country, those laws were enforced in a more strict way. So a lot of entertaining instead turned into the home, which meant at an increasing rate, people were bringing, sort of their public friends into their private space of the home. And it's interesting thinking about what dress in that context looks like. So one way we might think about that is through the image on the left. This is a paper pattern through Butterick, which shows some ladies' pajamas from the same time period. And I think we can see some similar design cues between these two pieces here. So we can see sort of like a loose tunic shaped top. We can see a sort of like open neckline, perhaps with a wide collar, which facilitates easy movement and sort of bodily freedom. We can also see that in many of these pajama examples in the pattern, that the pants are sort of wide-legged, which facilitates easy movement, but also at home, I guess we give you a little bit of modesty that these aren't really figure-hugging garments. But of course, people weren't really hanging out in their pajamas when they were wearing hostess ensembles. So there were a few cues drawn from that in the shape. But if we look at the materials that were used in this ensemble, and we'll look at this together more closely towards the end of the presentation, the designer, who was a relative of the donor, she used this really luxurious black velvet that just absorbs light, which is why it's kind of hard to see in this photograph. You can also see towards the bottom of the legs of these pants that there's a really beautiful silk devore that has this multicolored pink floral pattern. These are not materials that we necessarily think about when we think about pajamas, and really they relate more closely to some evening fabrics that were used in the 1920s. So in this slide, we have 3 examples of 1920s evening and dinner dresses. And I think they're an interesting point of comparison for this hostess ensemble meant for an at-home context. We can see that these have, in 2 examples, really elaborate surface design. These have, really stylish silhouettes, but you can imagine in sort of the lounging environment of entertaining at home, that something that has these sort of formal tonal cues with all this surface design might not be comfortable or might not feel completely appropriate for that context. So it's exciting to think about the ways this hostess ensemble kind of melded some of these high design fabrics, these formal fabrics, with the more casual and at-home style of pajamas, again, giving women the space to wear pants in a semi-public context. The next example we'll look at together is a piece by Tina Leeser. So you can see that in the photograph on the right, a red two-piece ensemble made out of a really stretchy jersey fabric. And luckily, we've been able to track down some source images to give us a little bit more context about how this piece was framed when it was first designed. So on the far left, we have a photograph from the Tina Leeser archive. You can see this piece illustrated on a fairly tall, thin, female presenting figure. You can see there are sandals with a sort of curled toe style to them, which is sort of recalling, some sort of culture outside of an American context. And you can see that this figure has sort of like a fresh tan in the illustration, which is then also echoed in the photograph on the middle from Life magazine. You can see a young white woman, again, with a healthy tan glow to her, making a sort of expressive gesture in this ensemble that really facilitated a lot of free movement. This piece was initially designed in the 1930s, a time when a lot of American designers were sort of making a name for themselves for the very first time. And a way that American designers did that was by creating sportswear. Today, sportswear can be very, very expansive, anywhere from a sport coat, a blazer. We might even include athleisure in our understanding of sportswear. So it's really important to think about Tina Leeser being one of the first generations of American designers to really think about clothing that people could be more active in and that might signal some sort of, sportiness, either through a lifestyle it was suggesting or through the way that the fabric allowed people to move. So what's really exciting about this piece is that it has a design I have seen not really replicated anywhere else. You can see that this has a pretty simple blouse on the top. And then for the bottom portion of this garment, which was called the dhoti ensemble, you can see that it's basically a big rectangle of fabric. On the photograph on the far left, you can see that it's sort of secured to the waistline just by being tied at the back, sort of at the lower back, with fabric then draped from the front of the garment through the legs to the back. And then if you look at the middle photograph, you can see that the ends of that fabric are then sort of tied at the center front, kind of by the wearer's belly button. This is a really innovative design that from a distance might read as a skirt, but it's really a bifurcated garment. So really a step away from wearing pants and something that would have been deemed appropriate for a public context. Of course, I had the question, what is a dhoti? And some of you might know, some of you might not, but I was curious to find out that this is a fairly traditional and not necessarily like sacred or culturally special garment that's worn often by men in India. It's traditionally been a part of clothing there for quite some time. So especially if we think about conversations about cultural appropriation, this basically sort of like garment for the lower half of the body, when worn in India, is something that is coded masculine. So it's really interesting that Tina Leeser borrowed this for women's wear. But I think it's also worth noting that this is not something that is special or sacred in the way that, like, for example, Native American regalia is something that people should feel a lot of sensitivity towards. This is basically a utilitarian garment. So while I think it is worth considering why Tina Leeser looked to India for inspiration, I think we might consider this an example of learning design lessons from a culture that is not your own to create something new and different, something that I think a lot of American sportswear designers did. The next example I have to share with you is from 1951, actually one of my very favorite pieces in the Texas Fashion Collection's holdings. This came to us as part of the original Neiman Marcus collection, which was a seed collection of several hundreds of pieces that the Dallas-based department store Neiman Marcus collected and donated to the University of North Texas. Along with those pieces was some documentation of basically how and why Neiman's decided to save some specific examples of contemporary fashion that they had sold in their store. So if you really zoom in and look at the scrapbook page that we have in our archival records, you can see that a note has been made that this was by Claire McCardle, and another one of those founding sportswear designers in American fashion. We have a date of 1951, which gives us a sort of, cultural grounding, chronological grounding. And then if you read below that, you can see it says, one of first television suits. I was quite curious to learn more about this, looking at the piece, because you can tell it's something slightly different than most garments because it's pants modeled on a woman around 1951. And if we look at the photograph of this model, unlike any of the other photographs we have in the scrapbook, this person is barefoot. So I think that gives us a little bit of information about culturally how this television suit was framed. I think if we think back to the 1950s, this as an ensemble really makes a lot of sense in that specific time, though. So during the early 1950s, television technology really progressed quickly, and that meant that more televisions were accessible to more people. So on the screen, we have the statistic that basically from the first half of the 1950s, the percentage of American households with a television leapt from 9% to 63%. Today, I think, especially during the pandemic, I think many of us have engaged in Netflix and binge watching television shows and being able to stream, video content very easily. So it's important to jump back to the 1950s and think about televisions being sort of a new leisure activity, and in some ways, an elevated or elite leisure activity. It's worth comparing this television suit made out of a stretchy wool knit. So basically like a sweatsuit like we might have today. Comparing that, which is in the photograph on the right, to a photograph we have from Life magazine from just the year before, of a woman seated in front of a television with two small children. And you can see this woman is wearing, to me, what looks like either a day dress or a house dress. This is a garment that was designed for a slightly different purpose, and for being really active, with materials that signify something perhaps a little more leisurely, but definitely maybe not the most comfortable thing to wear while lounging around in front of a television. It's also worth noting that in the early 1950s, a lot of people have shared with me that the first family on the block to get a television, people would often crowd around it, come from neighboring homes into that home, to be able to all watch a television show together. So wearing pajamas, which were really meant for private audiences, wasn't really appropriate, but wearing a day dress or house dress might not have been either. So this television set, this television suit, was really kind of a compromise between the two. And though I don't think today, if we went to stores, we would find anything explicitly labeled a television suit, I think we can imagine the ways that this has had cultural and design ramifications since. One more example with pants from our collection is this ensemble by Geoffrey Bean, another really important American sportswear designer. You might get tired of me talking about American sportswear, but I think there's definitely something in the air with it right now. If anyone's had a chance to go to the Met, the Costume Institute exhibition right now, some of these names definitely pop up in that show. So Geoffrey Bean, another important American sportswear designer, really set a standard for how Americans dress themselves. And in the 1960s made some really innovative headway with his designs. This collection from 1969 was innovative in a few ways. One is that this specific piece from the collection that you can see in this photograph of Bean with some models showing this collection, this piece won the National Cotton Council Award, which was given to designers starting in the mid-1950s to incentivize designers to bring cotton out of the kitchen. So instead of just making house dresses and things that were kind of a lower budget and maybe not as prestigious out of cotton, the Cotton Council wanted American designers to really celebrate cotton and bring it into new contexts, basically to make a larger market for cotton. Cotton is something that has been defined as American for many decades. It's something that has been grown here, manufactured here into fabric, especially for the sort of like practical and economic version of American fashion design. It's something that's easy to care for. It's easy to launder. It's something that's really durable. And those are all things that I think really appeal to at-home contexts too, especially as people, might be a little bit harder on some of their clothes. But especially with this ensemble, I think as another hostess ensemble is kind of bridging that at-home association with cotton with a sort of higher fashion aesthetic, since Geoffrey Bean was making high fashion designs. We can see that cotton here is deployed in a sort of empire-waisted tunic, which has a sort of bohemian flair to it that then is reinforced by these wide-legged trousers, which are often called Turkish trousers, another reference to Euro-American designers often finding inspiration from Middle Eastern traditional fashion designs. So wide-leg trousers are something that for many centuries have been sort of pulled into Euro-American fashion, often in sort of leisurely contexts, sometimes with problematic Orientalists, readings of them. Here we can imagine those sort of Orientalist readings leaning into a bohemian context at the end of the 1960s, which is definitely reinforced by this bold paisley print. Here we have an up-close photograph of that pattern, which is definitely eye-popping as the single fabric used for this hostess ensemble. Honestly, I could talk with you all for a whole nother hour about the history of paisley, but just know that it has historically signified for people in Euro-American contexts a sort of connection with the Middle and Far East. And that's definitely being deployed in a sort of psychedelic way with these lime green colors in this Geoffrey Bean ensemble. Next, I thought I'd share something that has gone from being far more private to a little bit more public, especially in the 1960s and early 70s. We have some really lovely examples of pieces that were from a partnership between Emilio Pucci and Form Fit Rogers. So many of us know Emilio Pucci for his eye-popping prints, which you can definitely see in this advertisement from Vogue from 1972. You can also see that in a piece from our collection in the middle of the screen, which is modeled in this advertisement. It's always fun finding those collection connections. But I think it's important to think about the way that underwear and loungewear sort of moved from being slightly less private to slightly more public, at the very least in the ways that the fashion press sort of presented it. So a phrase that has really sort of typified that shift was used by Vogue magazine through most of the 60s and part of the 70s, describing underwear and loungewear as fashion under fashion. So basically thinking about the ways that we have worn clothing under our clothing. But historically, a lot of that underwear has been meant to be invisible. So it's worn in very private settings, very intimate ones, never public ones. As we know, many people wear underwear as outerwear now. That was definitely not the case in the 60s. And because of that, a lot of underwear really had neutral colors to it. It was meant to kind of blend in with the wearer's skin. So especially with with this interesting partnership between Emilio Pucci, who's known for his eye-popping prints, and then Form Fit Rogers, who are known for lingerie and loungewear production. It's really exciting to think about the ways that sort of merging high fashion with underwear sort of brought loungewear and underwear sort of into a more public conversation. You can kind of even see how that's being represented in this advertisement, that it's not one person sort of standing on their own, being sort of shy and demure, sort of hiding their body, as many underwear ads were before this time period. But instead, these are all models confidently engaging with the camera that's shooting them. You can see them in a group, sort of suggesting that this is maybe like a slumber party or some sort of social occasion, a way that basically this at-home context of something that used to be hyper private is slowly becoming a little bit more public. And because I can't help myself, I have one more example of this partnership with Emilio Pucci and Form Fit Rogers. I'm kind of a sucker for a good print, and it's really wonderful seeing how Emilio Pucci kind of translated a lot of his handmade designs into something that was a little more suitable for more industrial production. Emilio Pucci was also well known for using stretchy jerseys. Emilio Form, a proprietary fabric that he helped create that was lightweight and stretchy, was wrinkle resistant, was really wearer friendly, and that it sort of could move and stretch with the wearer. So you can see how a lot of his other design imperatives kind of seep into this partnership with Form Fit Rogers. Another example that I was excited about for the exhibition is a designer who honestly was new to me. So it's kind of exciting to have a new figure to delve into as a fashion historian. So Josefa Ibarra is a Mexican fashion designer who in some ways has been referred to as the mother of Mexican fashion design, is sometimes called the Chanel of Mexico. Take those titles for what you will. But needless to say, they both sort of suggest an importance of her as a designer. She's someone who started sort of slowly getting into the world of fashion design in the 1960s, started a small boutique in Mexico. And then luckily, when Elizabeth Taylor was shooting a film in Puerto Vallarta, in a town in Mexico, came to the boutique and picked up many designs by Josefa, and then sort of then launched her career to a more national and international audience. I came to know Josefa by doing some research on Lady Bird Johnson's wardrobe, and Lady Bird Johnson loved Josefa. Again, Elizabeth Taylor wore her designs. A lot of women who maybe had slight leanings towards bohemianism, but maybe weren't completely counterculture. And especially people who vacationed in Mexico really loved her designs. I think this is a really interesting sort of inroad for thinking about things like caftans that were so popular in the 1960s and 70s, because a lot of caftans and forms like them come from more traditional cultural dress from cultures around the world. Examples of things like caftans you can find in traditional Mexican dress and dress from Central and South America. But I think one of the really exciting things about those forms is that the shapes, the silhouettes are pretty simple, which really lends them well to really interesting patterns and surface design. So as you can see in this piece in the exhibition, this has some really elaborate ribbon work. So all of the stripes you're seeing across the center front and then kind of dangling down are all satin ribbons that have been hand stitched to this garment. I love that this mannequin has such an expressive pose because you can see the bell shape of the sleeves, and then also imagine those ribbons sort of moving as the wearer does. It's important to think about what these ribbons signify, because one of the most important contributions Josefa made as a fashion designer to her culture and to her area was employing hundreds of women who lived in small towns around where her shops were, basically continuing traditional craft practices that were important to those regions and their histories. So as much as it might be complicated to think about, especially tourists, largely white American women coming into Mexico and vacationing there, what it means to pick up dress, artifacts in Mexico Mexico. But I think it's really important to remember that those can be strategic purchases that then put resources towards communities that really could benefit from support for these traditional practices, things that are especially led by women craftspeople. So I know I need to do more research on Josefa, and I hope you all spend some time Googling her later, can find some more good information. And then as our last piece to discuss here in the PowerPoint, I wanted to include a piece by Mary McFadden, who created a lot of hostess and at-home ensembles, but then also use this as a moment to think again about taking inspiration from non-Euro-American cultures and sort of bringing them into conversations in at-home dress. So with this hostess ensemble, I think we can see a lot of visual relationships between that and this pine trees print made in Japan in 1856. So print culture and fashion culture often kind of speak to each other, and that sometimes there's a limited color palette because of the way prints are created. So in both of these, you can see sort of limited sets of colors, greens, reds, purples. You can see that there are sort of stylized blocks here, that we have these sort of stylized clusters of leaves in both the print and in the piece by Mary McFadden. And also these sort of, gnarled and winding stylized lines representing the trunk and the branches of the trees. So we can definitely see a formal relationship between these two pieces. Again, especially thinking about cultural appropriation, it's important to remember that in sort of maybe appropriating or taking design lessons from these Japanese prints, that Mary McFadden was not taking power away from people in Japan, was not basically, perhaps stealing business from a Japanese printmaker. While I think, again, it's worth considering why Mary McFadden drew inspiration from this sort of source. I think it is, exciting to see the ways that new print forms can come from drawing inspiration from places that aren't, maybe as familiar to all of us. I'm also looking briefly in the chat, and I love that someone, thank you, Diane, for putting the Night of the Iguana and that name of the Mexican city that for some reason will not come out of my mouth tonight. I very much appreciate that. So sort of to wrap up this part of the presentation, I think it's really exciting for us to think about this at least 100-year history of at-home clothing in ways that it feels quite familiar to us, especially in, COVID era America, that there are types of fabrics like stretchy knits, like we can see in the photo on the right from Claire McCardle, that there are these new forms like the nap dress in the middle of the slide, and then these sort of far-reaching inspirations, as you can see in the Mary McFadden piece, that sort of all weave together into the wardrobes that, we kind of have ourselves, but that also sort of define us more broadly as a culture. And especially at a time when the pandemic feels like something new and perhaps frustrating and limiting, especially when it comes to our wardrobes. I think it can be really empowering to think about the history behind a lot of the things that we have available to us now. So on that note, I am going to switch presentation modes from my laptop to my phone so that I can share a few pieces, one that we talked about and one that we didn't, with you all live. So I hope you'll bear with me. We practice this with our fantastic tech Mitch. Let's see. So I'm going to hope this is a smooth transition. Excellent. So I hope you all can see me. If you can't, please type it in the chat. So I'm coming to you live from the Texas Fashion Collections space at the University of North Texas. It's going to get dark for a second. There we go. Make sure that our light comes on. So I'm joining you from our research room, which you can kind of see behind me. If you do take some time to look at our digital collection online, you'll probably recognize a lot of the mannequins that are in the background here, because this is where we've been working on digitizing our collection. And if you'll forgive me, the shaky camera, I'm going to put on a nitrile glove. So as we're handling some pieces, I'm using proper museum protocols. So I wanted to share with you all two pieces in person, because I think being able to look at some of these sort of up close and together is valuable, kind of modeling a research appointment that we often have for researchers at all levels here. So I'm going to flip the camera over. And the first piece I want to share with you all, you might recognize this from one of my first slides. This is that hostess ensemble from the mid 1920s. As you can see, even here, that black velvet just absorbs all of the light. In fact, my camera is almost having a hard time focusing on it. But you can see that it has a pretty wide neckline with a sort of fold over collar, which would provide a little bit of movement. I appreciate that this has two single welt pockets here, one on either side, which would be very practical for the wearer. I know we're always excited about pockets in fashion. And then you can see that we have these really dramatic bell-shaped sleeves. We have these inserts of a really lovely fabric. It's so exciting seeing this in person. So if you can see my blue glove through this, you can see this fabric is really delicate. It's almost, it's like a chiffon, very lightweight. You can see my fingers through that. Yeah, this godet is just lovely. Thank you for that comment, Mori. And you can see that this is a sort of devore fabric. You can see that there's been some losses here. So we can see the sort of like pattern that's part of the fabric, but then you can also see the sort of pile there too, which is just lovely in all these different colors. Another detail I love about this piece that makes it even more dramatic is that we have these slits here, one on each sleeve, and that would allow the wearer to put their hands basically through this big bell, or have the bell kind of hang down with their hands sticking out. Again, the comments, oh, the drama, right? And then I wanted to come around so we can look a little bit at the pants with this too. Again, we don't often get to see pants from the 1920s for women. So on one side of the table, you can see that this is the pant leg sort of hanging down, that there would be the possibility for this to be read really as a bifurcated garment. But especially as we look at those pant legs sort of splayed out, you can see how dramatically wide this is. So again, if we think about like Turkish trousers, wide leg pants, and what that means, in an at-home context, especially again, thinking about an Orientalist context, I think that's worth sort of poking at. But also like these feel like bell bottoms to the extreme. I think someone mentioned that word. These would be great for dancing and show lots of movement. You can also imagine that with how much fabric is here, that from a distance, this might actually read as a skirt on the wearer if someone were standing still. So I think that's worth considering, that these aren't just static pieces of fabric, but something that would be activated by movement. And again, as a sort of hybrid garment, I think it's exciting to think about ways that these maybe read as pajamas. They might relate to some pajamas we have in our own wardrobes. But then these fabrics are luxurious. They're opulent. They're not things that you would necessarily, wear, today eating potato chips on the couch. So it's exciting to think about the ways this is really introducing a different kind of fabric to an at-home context. So there's one more piece I wanted to share with you all before we go to our Q&A session led by Gordon. I wanted to share with you another designer who is represented in the at-home exhibition that we mounted. Hana Mori is one of my favorite designers, and also a Japanese designer who's very well represented in our holdings and not in a lot of other American museums. So this is a piece by Hana Mori from the early 1970s. Here, I'll get us up close for this. And if anyone is curious about her name, you can see it here. Yeah, I think a lot of people know her now through her perfume, which I think her logo is a butterfly. She's really well known for that. So this is a really incredible hostess ensemble in our collection. I think we can easily imagine how this fits into the Euro-American context of, sort of caftans, leisurely ensembles that are sort of loose sets that can be worn for hostess, hostess engagements. This is particularly a particularly stunning piece. You can see that we have the sheer fabric, sheer chiffon, that then a coordinated print underneath can be seen through. So again, if we think about this piece in movement, it's really dynamic and beautiful. You can also kind of see that on the sleeves, that they have this sort of slit in them, kind of mimicking the construction of a kimono perhaps. And then that as the wearer would move, you can see how those patterns kind of play with each other. A really, really gorgeous piece. I think it's worth remembering that Mori, as a Japanese fashion designer, was also really working within a Japanese and an American design context. So she's someone who's really credited with bridging those two design sets of design principles and imperatives. So we can definitely see that in the simple construction of this piece, that underneath we have kind of a simple tank dress with spaghetti straps, that has kind of like a loose shift shape. And then you can see that this is sort of like a loose robe that goes over it with really wide sleeves. We can also consider the ways that the motifs in this print really echo a Japanese design sensibility and a lot of symbolism in that culture. So we have some chrysanthemums, which are important in Japan. Many of these motifs are things that could be seen in, especially like obi and kimono fabric in Japan. So definitely exciting to think about the ways that this might read as a hostess ensemble in a Euro-American context, but also might read very Japanese to some people. Let's see. Oh yeah, Renee saying, please stop apologizing for designers being inspired by other cultures. It's a very complicated thing. Let's see, maybe I lost you all for a second. There we go. It's a really complicated thing. Figuring out ways that is done well and not well. And I will say that because the Texas Fashion Collection is part of an educational system here, and we're really working with a lot of especially early career designers, we want to make sure that designers are the people we're helping train are being really thoughtful about how they're engaging in their research. So I think we've seen a lot of really nasty examples of how people have done that poorly. And I'm really excited about ways that people have done it well. Finding examples where people have learned design lessons, people like Mori, who have really been empowered in her cultural specificity to then figure out a way to make something that's unique to her, really approachable and attractive to a lot of people. So yeah, it's maybe something that goes through my head a lot. And I would imagine most people don't think about it quite as often. So thank you for giving me that little bit of grounding. So that's the end of the presentation I have prepared for you all. I think now we're going to switch to a Q&A that Gordon's going to kind of lead. I know we've gotten a lot of really great comments. I appreciate how engaged you all have been in the chat. It makes me really happy that you all are excited about and passionate about fashion history, and so willing to go on this 100-year romp with me.
Well, let me say, as Annette and I are, and I'm very gratified, are personal friends, and I have been as many times as I can be to the Texas Fashion Collection, and I can't. The best way I can describe it is encyclopedic. Annette and I will be talking about something, and all of a sudden she goes, "Wait a minute. There's something you should see." And so we've pulled out some wonderful things. I see many different examples every time I go there. Annette and I share our love for prints. And I just wanted to say, as a side note, to bring several threads together is the Texas Fashion Collection was started by Stanley Marcus and the Neiman Marcus department store. And as we have several paisley lovers among us, if you read his book, Quest for the Best, Stanley Marcus, in his quest for the best, always had a series of questions that he would ask, like new buyers or even the restaurant he would go to, just to see. He would always ask, particularly the menswear designers that bought neckties, he would always ask them the origin of paisley, just to see how well they knew their fashion history and their fashion sourcing. If you can believe that, how incredible that is. Well, I did want to again bring some other intersections together and ask you, as I've said when we started, and as we've had in the conversation thread here, that we are really very much interested in the intersection of fashion, society, and particularly societal perceptions of fashion. And I got an interesting question that came in the chat box that Annette, only you can answer because you've done the research on the nap dress. But it asked the question about it making women look like little girls, and essentially making the argument, I think, that it's infantilizing them. And I'm curious if you found that in your research, if you could talk about that dialogue about imagery.
You know, that is a really interesting question. I'm so glad it's come up. So in reading some interviews with the fashion designer who created it, Nell Diamond, she set herself apart from a lot of the ways that people have historically designed fashion, or I guess more contemporarily designed fashion to empower women. So before becoming a fashion designer, she worked in a bank in a pretty high up position. And she'd basically go to work wearing really like beautiful, hyper feminine garments with her hair in braids, things that were floral and lightweight. And she kind of felt like that was sort of like a reaction against what people wanted her to be. So I will say that people always have agency in the ways that they frame their garments. They can if they choose to. Another example of how these sort of like child-inspired garments have been empowering in the past is if we think about the 1960s, that a lot of the clothing then was cast as being very childlike. It was out of reaction against things like our idea of the 1950s hyper-feminine, nipped-in waist, full skirt, emphasizing, a developed chest, that was sort of signifying the man and established culture. And a lot of people wanted to turn against that and used children's wear as inspiration for things to kind of give us a fresh perspective that was kind of counter to the idea that maturity is always where the answers are. So I would say that's one thing that we might want to think about with this. Another one is that Nell Diamond has often cited historic clothing, thinking about sort of like Victorian angels in the attic, and the way that like many women were thought to be sort of like beautiful and delicate and fragile, which I think we can definitely view as being kind of infantilizing and diminishing the role of women through their clothing. But that is also a way that like women have had a presence historically. And I think that's worth remembering, that, even though the history of clothing in women is really laced with like the oppression and marginalization of women, that we can't forget about the power that's existed historically too. And then from a sort of more emotion-fueled space, I know Nell Diamond has talked about these nap dresses, to her kind of signifying that sort of like dazed feeling you have when you like sort of sleepily wake up in the afternoon with sunlight on you. That's often something that we might associate with childhood, a time when maybe more of us were allowed to nap regularly. So, lots of ideas kind of baked into this, some of which are sort of perhaps sad and saccharine, and some of which I think can be really empowering and historically grounded and interesting.
Cool, great. Well, I'm curious something. I know so many of our viewers see fashion in a museum setting. As you mentioned, the Met exhibit and all. Describe how you install these exhibits and how you place them in the context of, you have very vintage examples next to, literally, as I recall, the nap dress was next to Tory Burch. How do you, which is definitely vintage inspired, but how do you make some of these, they're both creative, but they're also very, they need to be very sensitive as well, decisions. How do you make some of those?
So I will say, like, from an intellectual or academic perspective, it's been really important to me in translating academic research that I do in my university context, translating that for a more public and popular audience at a space like North Park, where there are 8-year-old kids and 80-year-old people who, have English as a first language, and some of whom don't. Some people who are steeped in fashion history, as some of us are, and some people who feel like they couldn't care less. So usually I try to frame exhibitions in that space thematically and with something that can be easily accessible, sort of familiar, something that feels relevant. So at-home fashion was really an important theme because everyone wears clothes at home. So everyone has an in point with this. It's also really important to me to mix historic and contemporary fashion in these thematic exhibitions, because having something that looks familiar is a better way to get people sort of on board, so then they can start thinking about things that are less familiar. Especially in a collection like the Texas Fashion Collection, we have nearly 20,000 pieces. That represents a load of individual human subjectivities. I like to think that there's something in here for everyone. I grew up on a farm in rural Western Kansas where the closest Walmart's 90 miles away and the closest airport is a 5.5-hour drive. I did not grow up being around haute couture. And it's really important to me that I found some pieces in the collection that intimately relate to my history and my lived experience. In curating exhibitions, it's important for me to include things like a nap dress because it's something that feels familiar to a lot of people. It's not incredibly, expensive. I think most people, if they desperately wanted it, could manage to save up $125 to buy one of those. So I think that's a really important part of curatorial work to me, especially at North Park Center. And then for the people who are museum and archive folks in the audience, I will let you all know that we mount things on museum grade mannequins, that we use conservation materials to sort of mount and stabilize pieces, that we do have, while the light levels are higher than we would prefer, the space is fairly climate controlled. There is a lot of security staff at North Park, which we really appreciate. And they've been really great about basically making furniture to really keep our pieces safe. So while exhibitions are always sort of balancing preservation with access, I think in this space, there's such access provided that, challenging some of the best practices for preservation are worth it.
Tremendous. And I apologize to our audience. I did simply skip over a question just because I didn't see it. And again, my apologies. So it reads, how will fashion at home go public, if ever, in a post, I hope, COVID world? And so thank you for the question. And I apologize for the delay in asking. Annette, you're on.
Oh, wow. That's a good and big question. I think we're all hoping that there will be a post-COVID world at some point. If I had to speculate what fashion might look like, after this, when we get there, I would say that I think some people are desperate for more formality, for more of those, evening fabrics, more surface design, more opportunities to dress formally. because those are parts of our wardrobes that we haven't really flexed as much. But it also wouldn't surprise me if a lot of people are no longer willing to put up with the discomforts of day-to-day dress. So it wouldn't surprise me if more people are wearing, clothing that's made of more stretchy knits, that's made of performance fabrics. Maybe we pull on a blazer, but we're wearing yoga pants underneath. I think that's kind of exciting that, we can keep pushing these fashion rules and kind of make them our own in new cultural contexts.
Tremendous. Well, we're just about at time. So my last question will be, what's next for Annette Becker in the Texas Fashion Collection?
Oh my goodness. Well, I have lots to share with you all.
if you can tell.
First, I would say we're continuing to work on digitizing our collection, and especially since I know many of you will not be able to visit us in North Texas, I would encourage you all to keep an eye on our database and watch as more pieces are made live there. If you follow us on social media, especially Instagram, we sometimes share sort of like advanced photos of pieces that we've been digitizing. So that's a really great way to sort of get an idea of what our entire collection's holdings include. Some of these pieces have not been seen by anyone for decades because they've been tucked away in collection storage. So you will have a front row seat if you watch that website. For those of you that are sort of geographically a little bit closer to us, let's see, on November 6th, we'll have an exhibition opening at the Tyler Museum of Art in Tyler, Texas, focused on the little black dress and its history. The first fashion exhibition in their space, drawn entirely from our holdings. In the middle of November, I think the 13th, we're opening an exhibition at the El Paso Museum of Art called Fashion Nirvana, from the runway to everyday. So exploring 90s fashion from haute couture to, sort of ready to wear run-of-the-mill clothing that would be kind of familiar and recognizable to a lot of people. And then thinking further into the future, on January 18th, we'll be opening an exhibition called Delight, selections from the Texas Fashion Collection, and that will be on UNT's campus. And later in the spring, we haven't announced this yet, so you all are, I'm being naughty and sharing it.
Go for it.
We're working with the Milners Guild, a national level hat making organization. They're having a competition, and we'll be featuring some of their prize winning pieces inspired by the Chicago-based designer Bez Ben, who is known as the Mad Hatter of Chicago. Be featuring some of those prize winning designs alongside some of our historic pieces that sort of think about humor and high style and hat design. So if you live in Texas, I hope to see you in all of these galleries. If you don't, I hope it's safe and that you can come travel and see us, because there's a lot going on.
We will definitely have you back. Thank you very much. One and all, everyone, Annette, thank you from me personally and from the Fashion Committee of the National Arts Club, and from everyone who's joined us this evening. Thank you for sharing with us. We really enjoyed it. So thank you one again, and I will definitely talk about you coming back.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.